Right, Peter, thank you very much for that overview of research, changing environment. It sparked off a few questions in my mind. Dealing with this complexity and potentially applying different approaches, collaborating with different people to address these kind of research issues, or, as you pointed out, spending time, perhaps more time than was the case before, understanding the problem on the ground, as you were implying. Is that a challenge in the sense that I'm thinking of funders, I'm thinking of donors, I'm thinking of research supervisors within institutions, who may have a fairly limited exposure to different methods and different approaches. Funders tend to want clear outcomes. Research supervisors want clearly defined research questions, and yet, by default, what you've described seems to sit not entirely comfortably with that. I'm not sure what you think about.
I think there's a serious challenge there. On the one hand, you have professional trajectories, institutions that can punish you if you take a new approach or if you adopt mixed methods research. If you're in a field where single methodologies like econometrics are heavily valued, then bringing in case studies or ethnographic work, will raise eyebrows. But I think two things. One is that funding-wise, and in terms of policy sources of financing for research, that there is a push towards opening up research and not looking at single variable analysis, but saying we know the world is complex, we know we can't explain everything, but what mix of things appear to be driving the HIV epidemic or some other set of factors. And the other thing is, I think it's incumbent on us to justify what's the value added of incorporating a case study that's pulled out of a large data set. If you take an outlier in a large data set and explore that as a case study, what do you learn and what can you say about the universe of phenomena that you're looking at? If you take an observation or something that's on the mean, can you make generalizations about what's causing that to happen, about the entire universe that's on there, and which would you prefer, the outlier or the one on the mean? So that's just to say that you have to sell mixed methods, and you have to show the advantages of combining, causal analysis with more statistical associations, or interpretive research, with survey research.
And so, do you feel there is sufficient evidence out there that we can draw on to make that case, or, for that matter, have people already made that case to an extent, and is that something that perhaps needs to be more accessible, needs to be able to be drawn on, or maybe it needs to be created? I'm not sure.
I think both. I think there is some really good research, for example, using survey data, pulling out particular cases to explore in depth from that data to help explain what the trends are, and a kind of nested analysis, right? First you create a large data set, and then from that you pick out specific cases to explore what that data set actually means. And then the issue of sequencing becomes really important. Do you first create a big data set, then the cases? Do you do the cases and then the big data set? So I think there is good work out there from the last 10 years or so.
Sure.
But there's a tremendous need to generate new work and to have better examples and cases of that kind of research.
And evidence so that you can communicate that well to senior academics or funders or policymakers, etc. I want to come on to the digital age, but before that, in terms of these kind of large data sets you're talking about, and that kind of research, I was wondering how that complemented or kind of came together with this move that we've seen over 20 years for highly participative kind of approaches in the community or even community-led kind of research. I'm wondering, what's the relationship in a way? Is there one?
I think it's really interesting. I mean, I think the tendency is to create a juxtaposition because of the degree of specialization. So the people who do action or participatory research are very committed to qualitative interpretive work, and the community defines the nature of the study. And the people who do sort of survey research and use government data fall on the other side of that. Having said that, there is community participatory research which collects data on the community and on which you could, if you wanted to, do statistical analysis.
Sure.
I mean, you could figure out, how much water does everybody in the community use, how much are they paying. You could put that in an Excel spreadsheet, generate some data, and then go to the government saying, look, you're overcharging here, you're undercharging there.
Sure.
And good survey research, I mean, I would say at the highest levels, uses ethnographic work. It uses focus groups. It does sort of deep interviews about how people understand the words used in the questions, the cognitive interviews. When we did work in Sao Paulo, Mexico, and Delhi, and we spent a lot of time in the areas where the survey would be applied. Right. Talking to people and saying, well, what really matters to you? Should we ask about garbage or should we ask about, noise pollution? Should we, if we use, the word pollution, does that make sense? Or should we use another word like bagunça in Portuguese, which is more like a mess? Or for clientelism, you have to do ethnographic work because every culture has a different language for clientelism.
Following a similar track, but maybe slightly sideways, traditionally research has placed a lot of emphasis on generalization, the ability to generalize, for obvious reasons, because you can act on that, you can plan, you can make something, etc. You can conduct some activity with some reasonable amount of assurance that it may pay off. Again, do you think there's a tension between that generalization and highly contextualized, specific understanding of a phenomenon?
I think that's absolutely the case. I think that's part of, with the move towards mixed methods research and taking a more encompassing view, that in a way hasn't, at least from what I know, hasn't really been resolved. I don't know if it's squaring the circle or not, but it's an area where, ideally you would want, something like, with mobile phones, where the basic technology of the mobile phone is generalizable, but in each country you could customize it, and the broadband that you need could be different, the design of the phone could be somewhat different, the apps could be different.
Sure.
So that's contextualized, but there's a generalizable platform behind that. I don't know how to do that. But I would imagine that that's an aspiration.
Yeah, and I think in the IT, as you alluded to the environment, there's this combination of generalization and personalization, which kind of echoes that. I mean, what one of the things I'm getting from your description is the researcher needs to be aware of quite a, I can't think of a word, but breadth of knowledge, almost like a smorgasbord of research approaches, research methods, research techniques, and at the same time, again, you've alluded to some extent, the need for specialization and depth. I wonder how you feel about that challenge in terms of the new researcher, coming up, probably far more digitally literate, perhaps, than say myself. But how do we give them, or is that possible to give them a taste, to give them a broad base from which they can learn more, but also choose? Do you think that's
absolutely
feasible?
Yeah, I mean, I think both at the level of defining questions and figuring out what you're going to conduct research on, you need to have a broad view of what's already been done, what do we know, what don't we know, what's contested, where do I want to contribute,
Sure.
right? Why should people pay me to do research if I'm going to do the same thing as you did 5 years ago, right? I need to know your work and say, okay, that's great work, what I'm going to do builds on that, or it's different for these reasons. So that means knowing the literature in the field. In terms of empirically, you actually have to know a lot to design a good study. So when we did surveys in Sao Paulo, Delhi, and Mexico, we worked with people who had already 10 years of fieldwork experience in those cities and who knew the texture of the fabric of local governance, of the communities, different parts of the city, how they varied. So we actually had a very sophisticated feel, that was sort of qualitative, that we used to design the survey instrument afterwards. And then for the interpretation, that's critical. You can't interpret survey data without knowing a lot about the surrounding context.
No, that's good. But it does sound that there is a need to expose our new researchers to perhaps a wider context than has been the case in the past.
What really frustrates me is when somebody wants to work on, let's say, the human rights of children born in prisons, right? So in Rwanda, you have the genocide. A lot of people end up in prison. Some of those people in prison end up giving birth to kids. The kids are not guilty of any crime. They have human rights. So how do they get good education? How do they, right? And so there's a very important question there. Now, the tendency is to say, well, there's no literature on that outside of Rwanda. There's no literature, I'm starting from scratch, I can do whatever I want. Or I don't need this broader context of what's been done. But there's a huge literature on prison systems and on rights. There's literature on other countries dealing with similar issues. There's other post-genocide or post-conflict regions in the world that have had to deal with that. So people need to broaden, the researcher needs to broaden out his view and say, okay, well, in other contexts, like what we had in Rwanda, what's happened? For other types of rights in prison systems, how does it work?
Sure. But at the same time, be able to draw on almost like a portfolio of methods, techniques, and approaches that may be appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see, I mean, when you look at a question, at a research question, you can tell what a certain methodology can help say about that question. Like what part of it can actually answer. And a lot of our choice of methodology doesn't really allow us to answer the question we asked. right? So we ask a causal question, but then we use a methodology that doesn't really deal with causality very well.
Sure.
Right? And then you write your conclusion in the paper, and you're like, oh damn, you know, this I can't really say this because actually my data doesn't allow me to say that. I should have done, you know, some other kind of additional work.
So really understanding the question, the nature of the question, the implications of that for approach and methodology and technique all needs to stack up anyway.
Yeah, they flow from each other,
Yeah.
wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would, definitely.